really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here again today for another episode. I'm going to be revisiting the topic of loneliness today. I talked about it, I believe, around 3 months ago when I was looking at loneliness and community, our need to have closeness to community and creating a micro community around us. But since that time, I've had a somewhat different insight into loneliness on the spiritual path. So I wanted to dive into it again and talk about it a little bit more because I'm coming to see loneliness as actually an essential experience on the spiritual path and something that we actually should probably not be trying to eliminate or get rid of or solve or fix, that we actually need to embrace our loneliness and dive into it. So some of this may be a little bit repetitive from the last time, but I have some new thoughts and new ideas to share, so hang in there with me. First of all, I came across this quote that touched me a little bit by John Steinbeck, who said, "All great and precious things are lonely." And somehow like that touches my heart because I just look out at the world around us and I kind of recognize like there's this massive tree in our yard that may be 100 years old. It's been here for 100 years and still alive. And it's standing there alone. And in a sense, it's part of a community in the forest, but that tree has its own path and its own growth. And I look at it and think, that is a great and precious thing. And it's lonely in its own sense of the word, not to anthropomorphize a tree, but there is a loneliness and a solitude about a big old tree like that. And there's no way to say that loneliness, that solitude is not the perfect thing for that tree to experience. So that got me started thinking a little bit more about loneliness and diving into it, and particularly loneliness as we are growing spiritually. And when I talk about this growth, I'm referring specifically to the inward arc of our spiritual growth. And you may have heard me describe this before, that we first begin growing on the outward arc when we're externally focused. We're focused on things around us, relationships, other people, our career, our job, our knowledge, our education, getting what we need to survive in the material world. The focus and where we're looking and directing our energy is external and outside of us as we work on this inward arc. And that's actually what we're supposed to be focusing on for, say, the first half of our lives, or for some of us, perhaps a little bit less than that, the first 1/3 of life. It's an important passage to go through, the outward arc, as we are creating a secure place for ourselves in the world and taking care of our physical needs and material needs in the world so that we can survive. But we reach a point in our development when suddenly we turn inward, and this is really a crucial point in development. And I wonder if it doesn't coincide with what some people call the midlife crisis, which is actually a call to turn inward and to begin to look inward. Though in our society, many people deal with the midlife crisis by doubling down on the outward arc, by doubling down on external material things, buying a sports car, getting a new house, getting a divorce, and getting a younger partner. Like like that time of life that we call the midlife crisis, I'm wondering if that could be an opportunity to embrace the inward arc. But it's most common in our society to ignore the inward arc and to continue to go full speed ahead on the outward arc and outward development. And that is the reason why many people arrive at the end of life and feel like, wow, I missed a whole part of life. I didn't even work on myself. I didn't even try to become a better person internally. I only focused on what I could gather and accumulate and purchase and accomplish and achieve in my life. So what I'm saying for those of us, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing that you're someone who has been called to your own inward arc. You've reached that crossroads, that pivotal point in life when suddenly you're no longer that interested in what is external to you, though of course you still want to have security and safety and have your physical needs met in the world. But there is suddenly a calling to go within and to begin to work on yourself internally, spiritually. And what happens at that point when we turn from the outward arc to the inward arc is that the ego begins to lose some of its control over us. We have awakened to recognize that there's something more to life than living by the desires and the demands of the ego. There's something else there. Life is about something bigger and greater and something more than just what the ego dictates and directs for us. And something bigger, greater, and more than the physical realm itself can provide. So when we come to that crossroads, the calling is there to look deeper within, to explore our own spirituality, our own relationship with our higher selves, with nature and the universe, and to find something deeper, something greater, something more precious in a way. And the moment that we begin on the inward arc, that is when I believe our spiritual loneliness begins, because already choosing that inward path sets us apart from the majority of people who are just happy to stay focused on the outward arc, on their outward journey. And suddenly we have interests and concerns that don't match up to those of many of the people in our lives, many of the people who've been on the journey with us. We suddenly now have interests where we're gaining new knowledge and wisdom that we may not even be able to share with some of the people who have been closest to us, because we know, for one, they may not get it, they may judge us, and also it feels so personal and so private, the spiritual path that we're on, that it is a precious, sacred experience that you cannot necessarily share with just anyone or everyone. It feels as though you need to preserve it and take care of it so that it's only shared with those who would understand and who would get it. And frankly, many of us don't have anyone in our lives who do get it. And it might be listening to this podcast is where you find a little group of other listeners and a group of people who do kind of get this idea of being on the inward path and working on your spiritual journey. And I found another quote this is by Rainer Maria Rilke, whose work I really love. I've always adored it since I was in college. And Rilke wrote, "I want to be with those who know secret things, or else alone." And so this idea of being with those who know secret things, who know the inward arc and the inward journey, who would understand it and get it if I tell them what I'm working on right now, what I think about, what I'm reading and studying and what I'm trying to learn. We want to be with the people who get that. And as Rilke says, sometimes it's better to be alone than to be with people who don't understand. And in fact, as I think about it, it's the ego that longs for companionship, that longs for other people, because our outward arc is all about relating to other people. And we put our time and energy into relationships. And in fact, our growth, the growth and development of the ego on the outward arc is spurred by the need to have better relationships. So other people in our lives hold up a mirror so we can see ourselves. That's how we recognize our need for growth. Again, it's all outward. It's all coming from outside of us. But other people are important on the outward arc. And we definitely need other people and community and connections when we're on the outward arc. So when we make this transition, and we can't help it, it happens to us. We sort of fall into the inward arc, and we may not be able to avoid that. We suddenly realize that we are more than the physical body, and we have a higher purpose for this life. And even though we still need to live and survive in the material world, our priority is exploring the inner world. So we might be content doing any kind of job at that point that provides us an income so that we can survive. But we want to make sure we're able to keep doing our inner work. No matter what job we have, we want to make sure there's an opportunity to focus on the inner work, which we realize is more important to us in the long run and on the whole. And we also see that our materialism, our focus on achievement and acquiring things that was part of the outward arc, is not truly the source of happiness or joy. We begin to recognize that. And so those things don't hold as much sway over us. We don't have as much desire for the trappings of the outward arc, because we've already learned, we've already seen that it doesn't really provide us with the joy and happiness that we're seeking, that we would like to have in our lives. We've already seen through all of that. I would guess that people who stay on the outward arc still believe, if I only acquire more, if I start making more money and I can get a bigger car or a better house or a different partner, or if I owned more clothes, that might make me happy. That might be the thing that would bring me joy. What I see from people I know who have stayed on the outward arc as they get older, there is still a drive to keep trying different things and acquiring different things. But it is true that with aging, sometimes the outward arc begins to lose its allure, because we have to cope with the physical body itself beginning to break down in certain ways. We have to cope with health issues we may never have had before. And the ego gets threatened and challenged by those issues. And the ego begins to lose a little bit of its sway over us. So even for people who may have been denying their inward arc and going full steam ahead on the outward arc, there may be a time later in life when the outward arc simply doesn't cut it anymore. It simply does not provide the satisfaction and peace that people are looking for. So even people who have resisted looking within may reach a point in their lives later on, and maybe it will even be after a terminal diagnosis, when they're close to the very end of life, that they may suddenly open to the inward journey and to looking within them. And I've seen that happen with hospice patients a number of times. So when I talk about people choosing the outward arc, there's always an opportunity and always time to take the inward journey and to begin to look within, even when people are at the very end of life. But I do believe that the inward arc requires a certain amount of solitude. We cannot do the work we need to do within ourselves unless we have quiet time. We have to be alone at times. We have to be alone with our own thoughts, alone with our meditation, just in the midst of stillness, in order to see within and in order to begin to grasp the concepts that we're trying to learn on the inward arc. And as I have been doing some reading of some of the wisdom texts by great spiritual teachers, it seems to me that they're all conveying a similar message, that we need solitude, we need quiet time and alone time in order to grow on our inward arc and in order to grow spiritually in the way we're meant to grow. And there's another quote. This is very telling, by Douglas Coupland. Remember, the time you feel lonely is the time you most need to be by yourself. Life's cruelest irony. And I think that's a great reminder that if there's a moment in which I'm beginning to feel lonely, it's my ego, for one thing, my lower self, that's calling out saying, I'm lonely, I need to feel connected to someone or something. And that's the time when solitude is what will help me get past the ego and into listening to my higher self and connecting with my higher self. A Rumi quote that I also love is, maybe you are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots. So what he's saying is, maybe we're looking to the outward arc for what is actually in the inward arc. We actually need to go inside and have solitude and be quiet and experience the loneliness. And I looked at some writings by Pema Chodron. I'm not sure if I pronounce her name correctly or not, but she talks about having a non-threatening relationship with loneliness as part of our spiritual path. And she calls it cool loneliness rather than like the hot, desperate, desiring feeling of loneliness, but a cool, relaxing, and more comfortable experience of loneliness. And she says that when we're in this state of cool loneliness, we can experience less desire. So the experience of desire and craving and wanting something more, that's the hot loneliness that comes during the outward arc. When we're on our inward arc, we have less desire. We feel, in general, more contentment with things being as they are. We begin to be able to avoid unnecessary activities or distractions, which is one of the keys of solitude. And it's rather hard for us these days with all the social media that's out there and all of the sources of information and just continual stimulation in our environment. It's sometimes hard for us to remove ourselves from those distractions, but that's how we attain the solitude that we need for growth. She also talks about being able to be in the present moment as much as possible. She calls it complete discipline, meaning staying in the present moment at all times. I cannot even imagine that. That sounds like a very advanced practitioner might be capable of that, not me. She talked about also when you're in cool loneliness that you have embraced, you're not searching for alternatives. So you're not looking for a way to solve the loneliness. You're embracing it. You're diving into it and accepting it. You're not trying to find a way out. And you're also not turning to old thought patterns in order to help you explain things. You're taking on a new mindset and a new way of looking at the world, at our connectedness, and at your inner life and your inner world. So I thought this was really significant. She emphasizes the importance of meditation, as does Thich Nhat Hanh, that the way we deal with our loneliness is simply to meditate so that we can connect with our higher selves instead of looking outside of ourselves for some sort of connection. And Thich Nhat Hanh also writes about the fact that it's our lower selves, our ego, that views us as separate from all other living things, and our higher self actually recognizes that there is no separation. We're all connected. So when we're able to really be connected and within our higher selves and operating from our higher selves, in a way, our loneliness disappears because we see that we're connected to everything around us. And I may have talked about this the last time I mentioned loneliness, but when we're in that state of our higher awareness, we can see, oh, I'm connected to that 100-year-old tree in my yard, and I'm connected to the grass and the wildflowers that are growing, the deer that just walked by outside my window. I'm connected to my neighbors. I'm connected to everyone. And so the idea of loneliness is just a notion that comes from the part of us that doesn't recognize that we're connected, that doesn't know that yet. The ego has not learned that yet. So another Rumi quote is, "I have been a seeker and I still am, but I stopped asking the books and the stars. I started listening to the teaching of my soul." And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. Again, if we can stop in the moment of loneliness, get into a place of solitude and do some meditation or contemplation, we can connect with our higher self, which is always bringing us the message of how connected we are in the world with everything. And Rumi writes again, "Do not feel lonely. The entire universe is inside you. On the inward arc, you have access to everything through this incredible life force connection to everything." So what I've come to understand is that loneliness is one of the phases of our spiritual development, and it's probably most likely to happen early on when we first embrace the inward arc and begin to work on ourselves internally, because our egos are still active, still producing thoughts that lead us astray, still interpreting the world for us in many ways. And it's the ego that says, you don't have any friends anymore. You're so weird now. These things you're thinking about and believing in, they're not like other people. No one will want to be around you. These are the messages that we hear from ego. So we go through this transition phase as we first begin to work on our spiritual journey. And it makes sense that that's probably the peak of our loneliness, when we know we've made a choice that sets us apart from some of the people we love and care about, and we're not sure what to do about that. We're not sure we can talk about it, and we might even feel embarrassed or ashamed of the choices that we've made in the very beginning, because we may not even understand it ourselves. Like, why am I like this? Why am I thinking about these things? Why am I pursuing this spiritual path? But there comes a time on the journey later on down the road when we are more tuned in to our higher self and the messages it brings to us. And that's when we find the loneliness beginning to dissipate, because we're constantly being fed this energy and sense of connectedness through our higher selves. And when we can remember our higher selves more easily, and in the moment, we can move ourselves beyond loneliness, kind of transcending the loneliness of the lower self. And also, I believe what happens while we go through a time when it feels like I can't relate to any of these people that I used to relate to, there is a time in our spiritual development, especially when you get to the second tier, which is when you become more integral in your thinking, in your living, in your spirituality, and all of your being, that stage of integral development. When you reach that stage, suddenly you find yourself actually able to connect with everyone and anyone. Suddenly there isn't a sense of, I'm so different, I'm so strange, I'm on some weird different path. Suddenly you're not really about that anymore. Suddenly you're so much more able to see the humanity of everyone. And it doesn't matter what they believe, what level of spiritual development they're at. It doesn't even matter what their politics are, how they live their lives. You suddenly have this higher view of humanity. And you know that each and every other person is connected to you. And you are all part of this same life force. And suddenly you find yourself able to relate on that very human level with all the people that you thought you would have to leave, that you couldn't talk to anymore or be around anymore. But that's later in the journey. It takes a while to reach this integral consciousness. You have to do a lot of work on the shadow and a lot of internal healing before you can awaken to integral consciousness. But at that point, it suddenly becomes so much easier to relate to other people. Suddenly you can talk to other people about things. And honestly, you don't even want or need to talk about your spiritual journey anymore. You don't need to tell them about what you're doing, what your practices are, what you've learned. You are simply able to be fully engaged with life, and you can listen to what their concerns are. And you can even reflect on that. Like, oh, I remember I had something like that happen at my job once too. And you can share with other people all of the ups and downs and the glories and the sorrows and the stresses of being human. And you no longer feel strange. You no longer feel like you don't fit in. But you do understand you may possess insight and perspective that other people can't see. And all you feel is compassion for those people. You get it. You used to be where they are. You couldn't see it before either, and you understand what that's like. So you simply operate from this place of compassion and greater love, and you are able to connect. And I think that's when actually this idea of loneliness doesn't make sense anymore, because suddenly, you can walk through a park and you're connected to every blade of grass. You're connected to every person you see, and you sense it and you feel the energy of it, and you know that you are not alone in the universe. And that's incredible. As Rumi said, that you have the whole universe within you. So remember, as John Steinbeck says, that all great and precious things are lonely, and it's okay to be lonely. And in fact, loneliness is a sign that you're on your spiritual path, doing your spiritual work. So embrace the loneliness. Try to find the cool, relaxing aspect of loneliness that Pema Chodron talked about. And do your best to stay on your path. Meditate, embrace solitude around you, connect with nature, listen to music, dance, feel your life, and live every moment of it. And as I always say, we're here for love. Love is the most important thing you could ever focus on. So now you just have to face your fear. Be ready for whatever life brings you next, especially when you're on the inward arc. There are all kinds of challenges that come up for you to work on. And remember to love each and every day that you get to be here, because that's an incredible gift and opportunity. So I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.